The morning Pauline Merritt arrived in Harding County, Texas. The wind was blowing so hard off the plains that it stripped the hat right off her head and sent it tumbling across the packed red dirt of Main Street like a tumbleweed with nowhere particular to be. And she thought to herself that perhaps this was the land's way of telling her she did not belong here, that she had made a terrible mistake, that the letter she had answered 3 weeks ago in a Kansas City boarding house was the most foolish thing she had ever done in her 24 years of living. She stood there in the middle of Caldwell's Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, watching her hat skitter away, and she let it go. She had come too far to chase after hats. Caldwell's Creek was not much to look at. There was a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Dusty Spur whose painted sign had faded to something barely readable, a post office that doubled as the sheriff's office, a small church with a bell that swayed in the wind and occasionally rang without any human hand touching it, and a scattering of houses along 2 unpaved streets that the locals called town. Beyond those 2 streets, the land opened up into something that could only be described as enormous, a vast and rolling expanse of Texas grassland that stretched toward a horizon so distant it made Pauline feel like a single word on a very large page. She had come in answer to an advertisement placed by a man named Matthew Lawson, though she had not fully understood the extent of his situation when she'd written back to him. The advertisement had been placed in a Kansas City newspaper, tucked between notices for farm equipment and patent medicines, and it had read simply, "Honest man, 27, seeking a capable woman of good character to share a working farm in Harding County, Texas. Land, home, and a steady hand are what I offer. Respond to M. Lawson, Caldwell's Creek." It was not a glamorous advertisement. It was not a romantic one. But Pauline had been sleeping in a boarding house with 7 other women since her mother died the previous autumn, working 14-hour days in a seamstress shop for wages that barely covered the rent, and when she had read those words, something in her chest had shifted. Land, home, a steady hand. They were plain words, but they pointed towards something she wanted more than anything she could name. She had written back. He had written to her. 3 letters had passed between them over the course of a month, careful and honest letters in which they each described themselves without embellishment. Matthew Lawson had told her he was a plain man, not given to fancy speaking, that he had been ranching cattle since he was 15 years old, that he had acquired 1 acre of his own land and intended to build on it, and that he was looking for a partner in the truest sense of the word, someone who wanted to build something real rather than something easy. He had also told her, and she had admired him for saying it plainly, that times were lean and that she should know that before she made any decisions. Pauline had told him she was not afraid of lean times. She had been living in them her whole life. Now she stood in the middle of Caldwell's Creek with one hand holding her traveling bag and one hand shielding her eyes against the April glare, looking for a man she had never seen, and wondering if she had just made the greatest mistake of her life or the first right decision she had ever made. She did not have to wonder long. He came out of the general store before she had taken 3 steps toward it, and she knew it was him the moment she saw him. Not because he was looking for her specifically, though he was, but because there was something about the way he moved that matched the letters he had written, careful and deliberate, nothing wasted. A man who had learned to measure everything twice. He was lean in the way that outdoor work made a man lean, all of it functional, nothing extra. His hair was dark, and his eyes, when they found her across the street, were the particular shade of gray-brown that Pauline later decided she would call the color of honest things. He was wearing a worn canvas coat and a hat that had seen considerable weather, and he stopped when he saw her, and he took his hat off and he said, across 20 feet of windy Texas street, "Miss Merritt." "Mr. Lawson," she said back, and her voice was steadier than she expected. He crossed the street toward her. Up close he was not handsome in the way that the heroes of the dime novels she had read were handsome. He was something better than that. He had a face that had clearly spent time squinting into sun and wind, with laugh lines already settled at the corners of his eyes, despite the fact that he was only 27, and his jaw had a quality of determination to it that was not harshness but something more like patience, as if he were simply prepared to wait out anything the world chose to throw at him. He held out his hand and she shook it, and his grip was firm but not aggressive, and when he looked at her directly, she had the strange sensation that he was not pretending to see anything other than what was actually there. "You made it," he said, and there was something in those two words that held more relief than he probably intended to let show. "I made it," she said. There was a pause that might have been uncomfortable with another person and was instead simply quiet, the two of them standing in the wind, measuring each other honestly for the first time. "I should tell you something before we go any further," he said, and his voice did not apologize for what it was about to say. "I told you in my letters that times were lean. I want you to understand what that means before you've committed to anything. The acre I own is real. The house on it is real, though it needs work, more work than I let on maybe. And the fence that marks the property line is broken in several places. I've been meaning to fix it, but there's been more pressing things and I haven't had the time or the lumber both at once." Pauline looked at him. He was watching her the way a man watches for the moment when someone decides to turn around and leave. "Is the acre real?" she asked. "Yes." "Is the house livable?" He hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "It will be. Roof is sound." "And the broken fence," she said, "can it be fixed?" "With enough work and enough time," he said, "yes." Pauline Merritt had grown up in a house where the roof was not always sound, and the walls were not always straight, and she had watched her mother patch and mend, and make do with whatever materials were available. And she had learned from that watching that the question was never whether a thing was perfect, but whether the foundation under it was worth building on. She looked at Matthew Lawson and she thought about his letters, about the honesty in them, about the way he had described himself and his land without attempting to make either sound like more than they were. And she thought about the fact that he had just told her, to her face, before anything was settled, that things were harder than he'd let on in print, because he wanted her to know the truth. "That is enough," she said quietly. "Let us begin." Something moved across his face, quick and warm and then contained again, as if he were not entirely sure yet that he was allowed to feel it. "All right then," he said. "I'll get your bag." The wagon ride out to Matthew's acre took the better part of an hour, following a dirt track that cut through grassland so flat and wide that the sky seemed to press down on it like a warm hand. Pauline sat beside Matthew on the wagon bench, and they talked, cautiously at first, and then more freely, in the way that people do when they discover that conversation comes easier than they expected. She learned that he had been born in Missouri, had come west with his father at the age of 12, had lost his father to a fever when he was 16 and his mother to grief not long after, and had spent the next 11 years working other men's cattle on other men's land, saving every cent he didn't need for survival, until he had enough to put a down payment on 1 acre of Texas ground. He had bought the acre 2 years ago. The house had been half standing when he got it, left by a previous homesteader who had given up and gone back east, and Matthew had repaired it room by room as time and money allowed. He asked about her, and she told him about Kansas City, about her mother, about the seamstress shop and the boarding house, about the years of watching other people's lives take shape while her own seemed to stay stubbornly formless. "I'm not afraid of work," she said. "I want you to know that. I know I look like someone who sat at a sewing table for years, which I did, but I grew up on a farm in Missouri before we moved to the city, and I know what work looks like." "I believe you," he said, and the uncomplicated directness of it surprised her into a small smile. The house appeared over a gentle rise, and Pauline braced herself internally because she had learned from experience that it was better to be braced. The house was small, 2 rooms with a lean-to addition that served as a kitchen. The boards were weathered gray, but the roof was indeed sound, newly patched in places with lighter wood that stood out against the old. The one real window had actual glass in it, which she knew was not nothing in this part of the world. There was a porch with 2 steps, one of which was broken. There was a well, which was perhaps the most important feature. There was a small corral with 2 horses, a bay gelding and a dun mare, and a chicken coop that had seen better days, and a vegetable garden patch that had been turned but not yet planted. And there was the fence. It ran along 3 sides of what she could understand to be the property, made of posts and wire, and it was broken in no fewer than 6 places that she could count from where she sat, posts leaning or fallen entirely, wire sagging between them. It was the fence of a man who had been too busy surviving to attend to the fine details of the perimeter. "Well," Pauline said. Matthew sat very still beside her, not moving to get down from the wagon, waiting. Pauline looked at the broken fence. She looked at the small weathered house with its sound roof. She looked at the garden patch waiting to be planted, and the horses in the corral, and the flat Texas sky overhead that was the most extraordinary blue she had ever seen in her life, wide and deep and endless in a way that made everything below it feel like it had room to grow. "The garden needs planting soon," she said. "If we're going to have vegetables by summer, we should start this week." Matthew exhaled slowly. "Yes," he said, "we should." They climbed down from the wagon. He showed her the house, moving through it with the careful manner of a man showing something he is proud of despite knowing it is imperfect. The main room had a stone fireplace and 2 wooden chairs. The bedroom had a bed frame he had built himself, and she appreciated the craftsmanship of it. The joints were tight and the wood had been sanded smooth. The kitchen lean, to had a cast-iron stove and enough shelf space for provisions, and outside the back door a barrel collected rainwater. "I'll sleep in the barn," he said quickly when they were standing in the bedroom. "Until things are proper. I want you to know I didn't bring you out here with expectations that aren't decent." Pauline looked at him. He was blushing slightly beneath his weathered skin. "We will sort out arrangements as we go," she said with a measured practicality that she did not entirely feel, because she was also acutely aware that they were standing in a very small room, and he was taller than she had realized, and the afternoon light coming through the window made everything feel very immediate. "Yes," he said, "as we go." The first week was the hardest and also the most clarifying week of Pauline Merritt's life. She learned the land the way you learn a new language, by immersion, by necessity, by making mistakes and paying attention to them. She learned where the water table sat by watching Matthew work the well. She learned which direction the storms came from by watching the horses shift their weight before the clouds appeared. She learned that the broken fence was not just a cosmetic problem, but a practical one, because without a solid fence line the cattle that belonged to a man named Reuben Fitch, who owned the large spread to the north, tended to wander onto Matthew's property and eat the grass down to nothing. Reuben Fitch was a large man with small opinions about small farmers, and he had made his feelings about Matthew's acre clear on more than one occasion. He did not threaten openly, because Matthew had a reputation for being quietly unmovable, but he let his cattle drift south, and he took his time about calling them back. And he had been known to suggest to people in town that Matthew Lawson was playing at farming on a piece of ground that wasn't worth the trouble of fencing. Pauline met Reuben Fitch on the 5th day of her arrival, when he rode up to the edge of the property on a big roan horse and looked down at her from the saddle while she was on her knees in the garden, setting out seed rows with a length of string and 2 stakes. "You must be the woman Lawson sent away for," Fitch said, not rudely exactly, but with the particular tone of a man who considers himself to be an authority on what he is observing. Pauline sat back on her heels and shielded her eyes. "I'm Pauline Merritt," she said. "And you?" "Reuben Fitch. I run the Bar F spread to the north, 500 acres. "That's a good piece of land," she said pleasantly. "It is," he said. "This piece isn't much, but I suppose it's what Lawson can manage." "It is exactly what Matthew can manage," Pauline said, and something in her voice made Fitch look at her more carefully, because she had not said it defensively but with a quiet finality that suggested the subject was closed. "I notice your cattle have been grazing along the northern fence line. We'll be repairing that fence this week." Fitch's expression shifted slightly. He was not used to being addressed with that particular tone by a woman on her knees in a garden. That fence has been broken since before Lawson bought the land. Yes, Pauline said, and now it won't be. Good afternoon, Mr. Fitch. Fitch opened his mouth and then closed it again, and then turned his horse and rode back north, and Pauline watched him go and then returned to her string and her seed rows, her heart beating a little faster than she let show. That evening she told Matthew about the encounter while they ate supper, and he listened with that focused stillness of his that she was coming to recognize as his version of very close attention. Fitch has been a thorn for 2 years, Matthew said. He's not a violent man, but he's used to getting his way by wearing people down. He thinks if he leaves his cattle on my grass long enough, I'll get frustrated and sell. And will you? Pauline asked. He looked at her across the supper table with an expression that was almost amused. No. Good. Because we need lumber for the fence and I've been thinking about how to get it. They sat at the table in the lamplight and they talked it through. And it was during this conversation that Pauline first understood what the letters had hinted at but reality had to confirm, that Matthew Lawson's mind was a practical and inventive one, and that he was perfectly capable of thinking creatively when he had someone to think with. He had been alone out here for 2 years, and solitude had made him quiet, but not slow. Together they worked out a plan. Matthew knew a man named Caldwell who ran a sawmill 20 miles east and would sometimes trade lumber for labor. Matthew had skills in carpentry that were worth something. Pauline had skills in needlework that were worth something too, and Mrs. Devereaux had been wanting new curtains for the mill house windows for 2 years. They would offer their combined labor for enough lumber to repair the fence, and they would do it before another week passed. "You'd do that?" Matthew asked. "Trade your sewing work for fence lumber." "Matthew," Pauline said patiently, "I came here to build something." "Sewing curtains for a sawmill wife to get lumber to fix a fence that will protect this land is exactly the kind of thing I came here to do. Yes, I would do that." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read, something warm and startled and carefully held in at the same time, and then he nodded and said, "All right. We'll leave Thursday." The trip to Devereaux's sawmill was the first time Pauline and Matthew spent a significant amount of time together outside of the immediate work of the farm, and it changed things between them in ways that neither of them named out loud, but both of them noticed. It was a long wagon ride, and they talked the whole way there and the whole way back, and they discovered in each other the things that letters, however honest, cannot quite convey. She discovered that he had a dry and unexpected humor that appeared without warning and disappeared again just as quickly, as if he surprised himself with it. He discovered that she was not merely practical but genuinely curious about everything, that she asked questions about the land and the wildlife and the history of the territory with a hunger that suggested she was cataloging the world as fast as she could take it in. She asked him about the cattle industry, and he explained it with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 11 years in the middle of it. She told him about Missouri, about the particular green of Ozark summers, and he listened with his whole face in the way that people who have been lonely for a long time listen when someone gives them something worth hearing. Mrs. Devereaux, a compact and energetic woman named Harriet who had an opinion on everything and was not shy about expressing it, welcomed them with the warmth of someone who does not get enough company and intends to make the most of what arrives. She fed them lunch and showed Pauline the windows and asked her a rapid sequence of questions about Kansas City while Matthew and Cal Devereaux walked the lumber yard. "He's a good man," Harriet said to Pauline, not subtly, while they were measuring the windows. "Been out here alone too long, though. Needed someone to come and remind him what he's working for." Pauline kept her eyes on her measuring string. "We are both working for the same thing," she said carefully. Harriet gave her a knowing look that Pauline chose not to acknowledge. They spent 2 days at the Devereaux place, Pauline sewing curtains while Matthew worked with Cal in the yard, and when they loaded the wagon on the morning of the second day, it held enough posts and wire to mend every broken section of the fence and then some. On the ride home, with the wagon heavier and slower and the horses working steadily against the load, Matthew said, without looking at her, "I want you to know that I know this isn't what most women would have chosen. Coming out here. The way things are." "I know what I chose," Pauline said. "I know you do," he said. "I just want you to know that I'm aware of it, what it cost you to come, what you gave up." She thought about the boarding house. She thought about the seamstress shop. She thought about the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people and belonging to none of them. "I didn't give up much," she said honestly. "And I have been looking at that sky every morning since I arrived, and I think I might be getting something very good in return." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The sky is good here. It's one of the things I could never explain to anyone in letters." "No," she agreed. "You really can't." They fixed the fence over the course of the following week, and it was hard work. Matthew did most of the heavy labor, driving posts into the rocky Texas soil, but Pauline worked beside him, holding posts steady while he hammered, stretching and fastening wire, and handling the more technical work of measuring and spacing with an exactness that made him look at her with surprised respect. On the third day of fence mending, they were working along the northern line, the one that abutted Fitch's property, when Reuben Fitch appeared again, this time on foot, walking along his side of the line with his thumbs in his belt and a contemplative look on his wide face. He watched them work for a moment without speaking. Matthew kept working. Pauline kept working. "You got lumber," Fitch said finally. "We did," Matthew said without stopping. "You plan to run cattle on this acre?" Fitch asked. "We plan to run what we can," Matthew said. "Expand as we're able." Fitch was quiet for a long moment, watching the fence go up, and Pauline could feel him recalculating something, could feel the particular quality of a man being forced to revise a plan that had seemed simple. "I'll move my cattle back north of the draw," Fitch said, and it was not an apology and it was not entirely gracious, but it was a concession, and Matthew straightened up and looked at him and nodded once, and that was the end of it. Fitch walked back north without another word. When he was out of earshot, Pauline said, "He's not entirely unreasonable." "No," Matthew said. "He just needed to know we meant to stay." "Do you think he knows that now?" Matthew looked at the fence post he had just set, solid in the ground, going nowhere. "I think he does." The spring deepened towards summer, and the garden that Pauline had planted came up green and promising. Rows of beans and corn and summer squash and tomatoes that turned the small patch of ground behind the house into something that looked, against all odds, like abundance. She had planted herbs, too, in a row along the south wall of the house where the heat collected, and they grew with an enthusiasm that suggested the Texas soil agreed with them. Matthew, for his part, had begun working on a project he hadn't mentioned in his letters, which was the expansion of the house. He had acquired, over time, enough salvage lumber and new boards to add a proper bedroom off the back of the main room, which would eventually allow the main room to return to being what it was meant to be, a living space rather than a sleeping space. He worked on it in the evenings after the farm work was done, and Pauline would sit on the porch in the last of the day's light and sew or mend, and listen to the sound of his hammer going steady and sure in the gathering dusk. She was there one evening in May when he came around the corner of the house with sawdust on his shirt and his hair pushed back, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he sat down on the step beside her, the good step, and handed her a cup, and they sat there together watching the plains go gold and then amber, and then the particular deep red of a Texas sunset. And neither of them said anything for a long time because nothing needed to be said. It was the first time Pauline understood that this was what people meant when they talked about a life that fit. Not comfortable, not easy, not without difficulty, but fitting, the way a well-made joint fits, everything aligned and holding. She was also, by that evening in May, beginning to understand something else, which was that she was falling in love with Matthew Lawson in the manner of someone who had not seen it coming and was now looking at it somewhat helplessly, The way you look at a sunrise that is more beautiful than you expected and realizing you are not going to be able to look away. He was kind. He was steady. He did not make promises he couldn't keep, and he kept every promise he made. He remembered things she said in passing, small things, and she would find evidence of it later. The way he started leaving the coffee going longer in the mornings when she mentioned she preferred it strong. The way he built the new bedroom wall with an extra window because she had said once, casually, that she liked to watch the rain. He was not demonstrative, but his attention was a form of devotion, and she recognized it for what it was. What she did not know, because Matthew Lawson was not a man who revealed his interior landscape easily, was that he was having an equivalent experience on his side. He had placed that advertisement with the practical expectations of a practical man, someone to help with the farm, someone to make the house a home, someone to face the daily difficulty of frontier life alongside instead of alone. He had not expected Pauline Merritt. He had not expected someone who looked at his broken fence and his one bare acre and said, quietly and with utter conviction, that it was enough, that they could begin. He had not expected the particular quality of her courage, which was not loud or dramatic, but was simply unwavering, a bedrock courage that showed up every single morning no matter what the day looked like. He had also not expected to find someone whose company he liked so fundamentally, whose mind engaged with everything around it in a way that made the world feel more interesting. He had not expected to look forward to supper the way he looked forward to it now, or to find himself thinking about her in the middle of work tasks, registering small things to tell her later. He was in love with her, and he knew it, and he had no clear idea of how to say so, because they had come to this place through a particular kind of arrangement, and he was not sure how to move from the arrangement to the truth of the thing, and he did not want to make anything awkward or difficult, or to impose something on her that she hadn't signed on for. What finally moved things forward was not a grand gesture but a thunderstorm. It came in from the west on a June evening when the air had been thick and close all day, building through the afternoon in the way that Great Plains storms build, with an intensity that makes the horses nervous and the birds silent and the light strange. Matthew had seen it coming and secured the animals and the garden stakes and brought extra wood under the porch, and Pauline had brought in the washing and banked the cook fire and done everything that needed doing with a calm efficiency that had ceased to surprise him. They were inside when the storm hit, and it hit hard. The thunder was the kind that shook the walls, and the lightning was close and frequent, and the rain came horizontal against the glass window, and the new bedroom wall with a force that would tell them in the morning whether Matthew's construction had held against serious weather. They sat in the main room, Pauline with her mending and Matthew with a length of harness he was repairing, and the storm raged outside, and the lamp burned steadily between them, and after a while Pauline looked up from her sewing and found him looking at her with an expression he hadn't had time to arrange, open and unguarded and unmistakable. The silence between them changed quality. "Matthew," she said. "I know," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. "I'm sorry." "I don't mean to, don't apologize," she said, and there was something almost fierce in it. "Don't apologize for that." He set down the harness. She set down the mending. The storm hammered at the walls and the lamp threw golden light across both their faces, and they looked at each other honestly, the way they had looked at each other across that windy street in Caldwell's Creek in April, but this time without any pretense of formality to hide behind. "Pauline," he said. He stopped. He started again. "I want to say something, and I want to say it right, so I'm going to take a moment to think about how." "Take your time," she said. He took his time. The storm threw rain at the window. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and he looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at her. "When I placed that advertisement," he said, "I was trying to solve a practical problem. I needed help on the land, and I didn't want to be alone anymore, and I thought if I found someone reasonable and hardworking and honest we could make something that worked. That was what I was looking for, something that worked. "I know," she said quietly. "What I found," he said, "is something considerably different from what I was looking for, and I'm not sure I have the right words for it, which is a problem because I'm not a man who can express things he doesn't have words for." He paused. "You came out here and you looked at my 1 acre and my broken fence and a house that was barely standing, and you said it was enough, that we could begin. And something about that has stayed with me every single day since. Because I had been telling myself for 2 years that it wasn't enough, that I wasn't enough, that I needed more land and more money and more of everything before I could ask anyone to share this life. And you looked at exactly what there was and you said it was enough. I don't know if you understand what that did to me." Pauline did not trust herself to speak immediately. "I am not offering you a good deal," he continued. "I want to be honest about that. What I'm offering you is hard work and 1 acre and whatever I can build from it and a fence that is now fixed in me. That's what I have. And I know that's not Matthew," she said. He stopped. "Shut up," she said gently. He blinked. And then the corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "What I came here with," Pauline said, "was less than what you had. I came with a traveling bag and 3 dresses and the ability to sew and garden and work hard. That is all I brought. And you have given me this land and this house and this sky and 6 weeks of learning what it looks like when a man is genuinely good. And that, Matthew Lawson, is what I did not expect. I expected a working arrangement. I did not expect to." She stopped and looked at the lamp for a moment and then looked back at him. "I did not expect to care about you the way I do." The storm was still going. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Matthew reached across the distance between the 2 chairs and took her hand, and her fingers closed around his, and it was neither tentative nor rushed. It was the way 2 people reach for each other when they are both very sure. "We should do this properly," he said. "Yes," she said, "we should. I'm going to ask Reverend Cole in town to marry us," he said, "this week if you'll have me." "I will have you," Pauline said, with considerable gladness. He laughed then, a real laugh, the first time she had heard him laugh that freely, and it changed his whole face, and she fell considerably further in love with him in that single moment. They were married on a Saturday in June in the small church in Caldwell's Creek, and it was a plain ceremony because they were plain people and it suited them. The witnesses were Cal and Harriet Devereaux, who drove the 20 miles from the sawmill with obvious pleasure, and the sheriff, a measured man named Tom Whelan, who had known Matthew for 2 years and shook his hand afterward with real warmth. Harriet cried, which she had apparently expected and had brought a handkerchief for, and Cal told Matthew afterward that he was the luckiest man in Harding County, which Matthew did not dispute. Pauline wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had made herself in Kansas City, and she had pressed it the night before with careful attention. And when Matthew saw her come through the church door, he did not say anything at all for a moment, just looked at her with that gray-brown gaze that she had learned to read, and what was in it was enough. After the ceremony they drove home in the wagon, and it was late afternoon, and the plains were gold and quiet, and they held hands on the wagon bench with the casual ease of people who have already decided that everything between them is settled. The summer that followed was the hardest and richest season of both their lives. The garden produced magnificently, more than they could eat, and Pauline began selling the excess in town, loading the wagon once a week and taking her produce to the general store, which was run by a man named Edwin Poole who was sharp about prices but fair, and who very quickly realized that Pauline Merritt, now Pauline Lawson, was someone whose business he wanted. The extra money from the garden went toward what Matthew called the expansion fund, which was their shared plan for adding more land. They had their 1 acre, and it was theirs free and clear, but 1 acre of Texas grassland could not run enough cattle to make a real future on, and they both knew it. They needed more ground. The opportunity came from an unexpected direction, the way the best opportunities often do. There was a homesteader to the east named Holly's Webb, a bachelor of 50-some years who had come to Texas with grand plans and discovered, as many grand planners do in that country, that the reality differed significantly from the vision. Webb had 200 acres, a number that would have been significant if he had the health and the labor to work it, but he had neither. He was not ill exactly, but he was tired in the way that a man gets tired when the work is bigger than his resources, and the end of the dream is closer than the beginning. Webb came to Matthew in August, which Pauline learned later was a thing that surprised everyone who knew Webb, because Webb was a proud man who did not come to anyone with his hat in his hand. But he came to Matthew, and he sat at their table and drank Pauline's coffee and laid out his situation, and what he was proposing was a partnership. Webb's 200 acres combined with Matthew's one, in exchange for a fair share of whatever they built together and the right to stay on his land until he was done needing it. Matthew looked at Pauline. Pauline looked at Matthew. "We'd need to look at the land," Matthew said to Webb. "Come any time," Webb said. They rode out the following day, all three of them, and Pauline looked at Webb's 200 acres with the same focused attention she had brought to everything since arriving in Texas. And what she saw was a piece of land that had been let go but not ruined, a piece that could come back with proper management and enough work. On the ride home, Matthew and Pauline talked while Webb rode ahead, and their conversation was quick and quiet and efficient in the way their conversations had become, two people who had learned to think together. "The water is the question," Matthew said. "His well is deep, but the yield looked good. The grass in the south quarter is grazed down, but it'll recover if we rotate properly. He's asking for 1/3 of the profits," Pauline said, "and the right to stay in the house. That's fair. He'll also provide the land, which is the biggest thing we don't have." "Can we manage 200 acres?" Pauline said. "Just the two of us." Matthew was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Not cattle, not right away. But we could fence and manage the southern quarter for our own cattle while we run sheep on the rest, and sheep need less hands than cattle." "Sheep," Pauline said, turning the word over. She had not thought of sheep. "There's a market for wool." "There's a good market for wool," he said. "And for mutton in the camp towns to the south." "All right," she said. "I think we should do it." He looked at her. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "Webb is a good man in a hard spot, and we have a chance to help both him and ourselves, and that seems like the kind of chance you should take when it comes to you." They shook hands with Hollis Webb the following day and put the agreement in writing at the sheriff's office in town, with Tom Wellen as witness. And it was a good agreement, honest and clear and fair to all parties. The work of managing the combined land was considerable, and the fall of 1882 was the busiest and most exhausting season either of them had ever lived through. They acquired 12 sheep from a rancher to the south who was reducing his flock, and Pauline, who had no prior experience with sheep, threw herself into learning everything about them with the concentrated energy she brought to every new challenge. Matthew was a quick study with any kind of animal, and between them they managed the flock through its first Texas fall without loss. Hollis Webb, who had agreed to stay in his house and provide what help he could, proved more useful than either of them had expected. He was a man of considerable knowledge about the land and its particular rhythms, where the water sat underground, which way the floods ran in heavy rain, where the soil was rocky, and where it was deep and workable, and he passed this knowledge to them freely, in the manner of a man who has finally found people worth passing it to. Something else happened that fall that Pauline had not expected, which was that she and Hollis Webb became friends, genuinely and simply. She brought him food twice a week and sat with him while he ate it and they talked, and he was a man of surprising intellectual range. He had read widely and remembered everything he had read, and their conversations ranged from sheep management to Missouri rivers to the history of the Texas Territory to the novels of Charles Dickens, which it turned out they had both read and both had opinions about. Matthew watched this friendship develop with something that was partly amusement and partly admiration, because Pauline had the quality of making everyone she met feel worth her time, and it was not a quality that could be faked. Winter came hard in December of 1882, a cold that settled into the bones of the land and stayed there. The sheep needed extra attention, and the cattle needed bringing close, and the house, despite the new bedroom and the patched roof, showed its drafts. Pauline stuffed rags into the gaps along the windowsills, and Matthew built up the porch wall to cut the wind. And they spent their evenings close to the fireplace, Pauline with her mending or her books and Matthew with his planning and his figures. And they talked, and they were quiet in equal measure, and both were good. There was one bad night in January when a blue norther came through with a wind so cold and sharp it felt like a physical force, and 2 of the sheep got through a gap in the fence, Matthew's fixed fence, the fence that had withstood the summer and the fall, but that the January freeze had contracted and loosened in one bad night. Matthew went out in it, and Pauline went with him, because he hadn't asked her not to, and they found the 2 sheep huddled in a gully not a quarter-mile from the flock, cold and frightened but alive, and they brought them back in the dark, and the wind with their hands numb and their breath coming in visible clouds. Back inside, warming their hands around coffee cups, Matthew said, "You didn't have to come out in that." "You were out in it," Pauline said simply. He looked at her over his coffee cup with that expression she had come to think of as his truest one, the one that was not performing anything. "Pauline," he said. "Matthew," she said. "I don't tell you enough," he said, "how grateful I am for all of it. You show me," she said. "Every day you show me, that counts more." He reached across and touched her face briefly, just the backs of his fingers against her cheek, cold still from outside, and she turned her face into the touch for a moment. And then he stood up and said he needed to check the fire in the lean-to, and she let him go, because she understood by now that he expressed his deepest feelings in the interval between moments rather than in the moments themselves. Spring of 1883 came with an announcement that changed the shape of everything. Pauline was expecting a child. She told Matthew on a morning in March when the world was just beginning to soften at the edges, the first tentative green coming back to the grass, the days long enough again to see the land by something other than lamplight. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything over breakfast, looking at him directly. He set down his coffee cup very carefully. "You're certain?" he said. "I'm certain." He was quiet for so long that she began to wonder if she had misjudged how he would receive it. Then he stood up from the table and came around to her side and sat down on the bench beside her and took both her hands in his, and he said, with a directness that held no pretense, "Pauline, I am so glad." She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was held. "I'm glad too," she said, "though I'll admit I was nervous to tell you." "Why?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because we have so much we're building," she said, "and a child it's a great deal more to manage." "A child," he said, and his voice had that quality again, that warmth that he kept carefully contained and that leaked out at the edges of important moments, "is not something to manage. A child is something to be glad about. Everything else we'll figure out." They told Holly's Webb that afternoon, and the old man looked at them across his kitchen table with an expression of such uncomplicated pleasure that Pauline felt her throat tighten. "This land is going to have a family on it," Webb said. "That's what land is for." The pregnancy was not easy in all its particulars, because Pauline was a healthy woman, but the Texas summer was fierce, and the work of the farm did not stop for anyone's condition, and she was too practical to pretend otherwise. But she managed it with the same unwavering steadiness with which she managed everything, and Matthew was attentive in ways that were both practical and tender, doing more of the heavy physical work without making a point of it, bringing her water in the field, finishing tasks she had started when she was tired, and sitting with her in the evenings with his hand resting easy on her back. The town's women were also kind, in the practical frontier way. Harriet Devereaux drove out twice from the sawmill to spend a day with Pauline, bringing useful things: flannel for baby clothes, a recipe for a tonic that had helped with Harriet's own pregnancies, a hand-sewn cradle blanket in a pattern of yellow and cream. A woman from the church named Grace Tanner, who was the nearest neighbor to the west at about 3 miles, stopped by with similar practical gifts and stayed for tea and was good company. Matthew watched all of this, the network of care that Pauline built, or rather allowed to build itself around her, with a quiet astonishment. He had been alone in this landscape for 2 years, and he had not known it was possible to be anything else. She was showing him a different way of being in a place, connected and intentional and present, and he was learning it by watching. Their son was born in November of 1883, on a cold, clear night that made the stars look close enough to touch. He arrived with a set of lungs that announced themselves without apology, and Harriet Devereux, who had driven out to help, looked at Pauline over the baby's red and outraged face and said, "Well, he knows what he wants." They named him James, after Pauline's father and Matthew's grandfather, and he had dark hair like Matthew's and the particular gray-brown eyes that Pauline had come to think of as belonging specifically to the Lawson face. Matthew held his son for the first time with the careful and slightly stunned expression of a man encountering something he does not have adequate categories for. And Pauline, exhausted and happy and watching him from the pillow, thought that she had never in her life seen anything as entirely right as that man holding that child in that room. "Hello, James," Matthew said quietly to the baby, and the baby, who had been alternating between protest and contemplation, went abruptly still and appeared to look at his father with something like interest. "He knows your voice," Pauline said. "That can't be right," Matthew said, but he was smiling. "It can," Pauline said. "It is." Matthew looked down at the baby and then at his wife and said, low enough that only she could hear, "How do you know so much?" "I pay attention," she said. "You should try it." He laughed, and James startled slightly at the sound and then settled again, and it was, Pauline would think later, one of the best moments of her entire life. The year James was born was also the year that their fortunes on the land turned decisively in a positive direction, not dramatically, not overnight, but in the steady accumulating way of people who have been working correctly for long enough. The sheep flock had grown. The wool clip in the spring of 1883 had been their first significant income beyond the garden and the household, and they had invested it carefully back into the land, repairing more fencing on Webb's 200 acres, acquiring 4 more breeding ewes, and putting down a second well in the east quarter that increased their water security considerably. Their cattle, 6 head by the end of 1883, were grazing on the southern quarter that Matthew had fenced and managed through the summer, and they were in good condition going into winter. Holly's Webb's health had declined somewhat over the year, the winters being hard on him, but his mind remained sharp and his knowledge remained invaluable, and Pauline continued her twice-weekly visits, now sometimes bringing baby James in his blankets, which seemed to revive Webb in some way, the sight of the baby in his kitchen, the evidence of what the land was producing beyond wool and beef. In the spring of 1884, Reuben Fitch came to call. He came properly this time, riding up to the house in the middle of the morning and dismounting and tying his horse to the new hitching post. Matthew had built it the previous fall, and knocking on the door. Pauline answered it with James on her hip and flour on her hands, and she looked at Fitch without alarm. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "come in. Coffee." Fitch came in and took off his hat and sat at the table, and Matthew came in from outside a few minutes later and saw Fitch sitting there drinking coffee with Pauline, which was a thing he had not seen before, and his expression was careful and neutral. Fitch had come with a proposition. He wanted to talk about grazing rights on the Webb acres, specifically the north section that bordered his own land. He had always grazed that ground, in the informal way that large ranchers graze unoccupied ground, and now that it was being managed he could see he was going to lose that access. What he was proposing was a formal arrangement, a payment per head per season, in exchange for the right to run some of his cattle on the northern section through the summer months. Matthew looked at Pauline. Pauline looked at Matthew. "What are the numbers you're thinking?" Pauline asked Fitch, because she had become, over the past 2 years, the one of them more comfortable with direct financial negotiation. Fitch named a figure. Pauline named a higher figure. Fitch looked at her with the expression of a man who keeps being surprised by the same woman. They went back and forth in a manner that was businesslike and not unfriendly, and they settled on a number that was closer to Pauline's figure than Fitch's, and they shook hands on it, and Matthew showed Fitch out while Pauline wrote the terms down in the ledger she kept. When Matthew came back inside, he looked at her for a moment with a smile she rarely saw on him, wide and warm and unguarded. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "The seamstress shop," she said. "We were paid by the piece. You learned very quickly how to negotiate what the piece was worth." He shook his head slowly, and the smile did not leave his face. James, from his position on the blanket on the floor where he had been placed to conduct his important business of reaching for things he could not quite reach, made a sound of general satisfaction. "He agrees with me," Pauline said. "He always agrees with you," Matthew said. "Smart boy." The summer of 1884 was the summer everything finally felt real in the way that things sometimes take 2 years to feel real. The farm was working. Not flourishing yet, not abundant, but solidly, demonstrably working. The sheep were doing well. The cattle were healthy. The garden was producing more than ever, and Pauline had expanded her arrangement with Edwin Poole at the general store to include preserved goods, jams and pickled vegetables and dried herbs, that she produced through the summer for winter sale, and the income from those preserves was not insignificant. The new bedroom in the house now held James's cradle, and the main room had been properly reclaimed as a living space, and Matthew had built a second work table in the kitchen lean-to, because Pauline had simply run out of space for her preserving operation. He had also built her a proper wardrobe in the bedroom, because her clothes had been living in a trunk since she arrived, and he had carved a small running horse on the door panel of it without telling her he was going to do it, and she had touched it when she first saw it with a look on her face that made him very glad he had thought to do it. One afternoon in August, Pauline was sitting on the porch shelling beans with James playing in the dirt at her feet, when she looked out at the land and felt something she had no adequate word for, a kind of quiet satisfaction that was not complacency, because there was still so much to do, but a bedrock sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She thought about the Kansas City boarding house. She thought about the seamstress shop. She thought about the newspaper advertisement that she had read by candlelight in a room she shared with 7 other women, and the 3 letters that had passed between herself and Matthew, and the moment she had arrived in Caldwell's Creek with her hat blowing away in the wind. She thought about the broken fence. She smiled at the broken fence in her memory because it was fixed now, had been fixed for over 2 years, and it had been the first thing they had worked on together, and she would always think of it as the beginning of what they had built. Matthew came around the corner of the house, coming back from the east pasture where he had been checking the fencing, and he stopped when he saw her face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming up the steps and dropping into the other chair. "The fence," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Which section? The broken one, the original one, when you told me it was broken?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought that was going to be the thing that sent you back to Kansas City," he said. "I know you did," she said. "You had that look." "What look?" "The look of a man preparing to be disappointed," she said. "I've seen it on you. You had it when I arrived, and you had it when you told me about the fence, and you had it when we shook hands with Holly's Webb and you weren't sure if the partnership was going to work." He considered this. "Am I that obvious?" "Only to me," she said, "and only because I pay attention." He reached over and took a handful of beans from the bowl and began shelling them, working alongside her as naturally as breathing, and James looked up from his investigation of a particularly interesting pebble and said something in the emphatic but incomprehensible language of a 10-month-old, clearly meaning to contribute to the conversation. "He has a lot to say," Matthew said. "He takes after his father," Pauline said. "He keeps most of it inside and then it comes out all at once." Matthew laughed. And it was that free laugh she loved, the one that changed his whole face. James heard it and laughed too, in the way of babies, a full-body delighted sound, and Pauline sat between her husband and her son in the August afternoon and thought that the word for what she was feeling, the word she had been looking for, was simply this: home. Hollis Webb died in the winter of 1885. He died as he had lived, without drama or complaint, and Pauline was with him when he went, because she had known for several weeks that the time was coming, and she had made sure not to leave him alone on the bad days. She held his hand and talked to him about spring, about the plans for the north section and the flock and the new lambs, and he listened with his eyes closed and his breathing slow, and at the end he said, clearly and with satisfaction, "Good land, good people on it," and then he was gone. He had no family to speak of, no one to notify, but he had made a proper will with Caldwell's Creek's only lawyer, a neat, dry man named Abernathy, and the will left his full interest in the 200 acres to Matthew and Pauline Lawson, with a single condition: that a stone marker be placed on the land with his name on it, so that someone would know he had been there. Matthew ordered the stone from a mason in the nearest city, and when it came they placed it together, the three of them, Matthew and Pauline and little James, who was walking now and very serious about the business of going from one place to another, in the southeast corner of what was now entirely their land, where a stand of live oaks gave shade and the ground was quiet. Matthew said a few words, and they were the right words because he had thought about them carefully. He said that Hollis Webb had loved this land and given them the chance to love it too, and that a life spent working good ground was not a small thing, and that they would take care of it as he had meant it to be cared for. Pauline said, "He was a good man and a good friend, and we will not forget him." James, prompted by some instinct of ceremony, was very quiet throughout, his small hand in his father's big one, looking at the stone with round gray-brown eyes. With Webb's full share now theirs, Matthew and Pauline Lawson owned, free and clear between them, 201 acres of Harding County, Texas. Matthew sat on the porch step that evening, looking out at the land in the last light, and Pauline sat beside him, and for a long time neither of them said anything. "He was right," Matthew finally said. "Good land, good people on it," Pauline agreed. They sat there until the stars came out, and James slept inside, and the sheep were quiet in the east pasture, and the cattle were settled in the south quarter, and the fence, the whole perimeter of their land, stood solid and entire. The year 1886 brought two things: their second child and their first real expansion into the cattle market. Their daughter arrived in April of that year, red-faced and furious about something, and Harriet Devereaux, who had made the drive out again, declared her the most opinionated baby she had ever seen, which was considerable praise from Harriet. They named her Clara Me, after no one in particular, but because the name felt right, and Clara proved from the very beginning to have a character that was entirely her own, louder and more volatile than her brother, with opinions she expressed at full volume and a laugh that could fill a room. James, at 2½, regarded his new sister with a cautious and scientific interest that made his father smile every time. The cattle expansion had been planned for 2 years, saved for and studied, Matthew reading everything he could find on range management and market prices, Pauline keeping the figures and correspondence. They bought 15 additional head in the spring of 1886, bringing their cattle operation to something that could properly be called a small ranch, and they hired their first hand, a young man of 22 named Del Sanchez, whose family had been in Texas for 3 generations, and who knew cattle the way some people know music, instinctively and completely. Del proved to be everything they needed, capable and honest and not given to trouble, with a quiet humor that fit well with the particular texture of life on the Lawson place. Matthew gave him the repaired linta behind the barn for his quarters, and Pauline made sure there was always enough at the table, and Del repaid this decency with the kind of work that you cannot pay for but can only earn by being worthy of it. The year moved forward with the full and textured quality of a life that has found its proper shape. Matthew and Dell managed the cattle and the fencing and the heavier land work. Pauline ran the household, the garden, the preserves operation, the ledger, and the twice-monthly trips into Caldwell's Creek to conduct business, accompanied more often than not by James, who was old enough to be good company and young enough to find everything interesting. In town, Pauline had become a known and respected figure, which was something she had not sought and did not think much about, but that Matthew was quietly proud of in the way he was quietly proud of everything she did. Edwin Poole at the general store deferred to her judgment on prices. Grace Tanner at the church had made her a member of the committee that organized the seasonal community events. Tom Wellen, the sheriff, consulted her once on a matter involving a dispute between two ranchers over a fence line, because he said she had the clearest head for property questions of anyone he knew. Matthew was at the forge in the yard one afternoon when Pauline came back from one of these trips, climbing down from the wagon with James at her side, and she had the particular look she got when something had pleased her considerably. "What happened in town?" he asked. "Edwin Poole wants to expand the order for preserved goods," she said. "He says he can sell 3 times what I'm currently supplying, and he's offered a fixed contract, a real one with prices guaranteed for a season." Matthew set down his work. "How much?" She told him the number. He looked at her for a moment. "That's significant," he said. "It is," she agreed. "But it means I'll need more help in the kitchen for the summer. I was thinking about Grace Tanner's eldest daughter. She's 16, she's capable, and her family could use the income." "All right," he said without hesitation. "If that's what you need, then that's what we do." She looked at him. He was covered in soot and his sleeves were rolled up and his hair was pushed back from his forehead, and he was looking at her with that attentive directness that she had fallen in love with on a November evening in a thunderstorm 3 years ago, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had gotten the best part of this arrangement by considerable measure. "Come have lunch," she said. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. "You always say 5 minutes and then it's 20, she said. "I'll try for 10, he said. James, who had been listening to this exchange with great attention, said firmly, "Come inside, Papa," and Matthew looked at his son with an expression of mingled amusement and mild defeat. "All right," he said. "I'm coming." The summer passed in the heat and work of a productive season, and the fall brought the first real cattle sale, 15 head to a buyer out of Fort Worth who came through the county in October. And the price was fair and the money was real. And Matthew came home from the transaction with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been working toward something for a long time and has now arrived at it. That evening, after the children were in bed, he sat down across from Pauline at the kitchen table and he put the payment figures in front of her and he said, "I think we can buy the Morgan pasture in the spring." The Morgan pasture was 40 acres to the east that had come available when the Morgan family, a series of hard years having worn them down, had decided to return to Missouri. It was good grass and it had a small seasonal creek. Pauline looked at the figures. She looked at Matthew. "We can do it without straining the operating account?" she asked. "If the wool clip is what I expect and the winter beef price holds," he said. "Yes." "Then yes," she said. "Let's buy the Morgan pasture." He smiled. It was the smile she liked best, the one that was not for any audience but her, the one that meant he was very happy. "You know," he said, "when I placed that advertisement in the newspaper, I was hoping to find someone who would help me keep 1 acre from failing." "I know," she said. "We have 241 acres, he said. "By spring." "We do," she said. "And a fixed contract for preserves and 15 more cattle and Dell in the lean-to and 2 children." "From 1 acre, he said. "And a broken fence." "And a broken fence," she agreed. "Which is fixed." He reached across the table, as he had done on a stormy night in June of 1882, and took her hands. "Pauline," he said, "I want to say something I don't say enough." "You say everything that needs saying," she said. "Not everything," he said. "Not this." He held her hands and he looked at her directly and he said, "You are the best thing that ever happened to this land and to me. And I am grateful every single day that you answered that advertisement and got on that wagon and came out here, and I am grateful that you looked at one broken-down acre and a broken fence, and you said it was enough. Because you were the thing that made it enough. That has always been true." Pauline looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with the fire burning low in the hearth and the children sleeping and the land outside quiet and theirs, and she said, "I looked at that acre and that fence and I said it was enough because I could see what it could become. And I was right about that. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known from 3 letters, was that the reason it was going to become what it became was you. Your steadiness, your honesty, the way you work, the way you care about things. I chose to come because the land seemed worth trying for. I chose to stay because you are worth staying for." He squeezed her hands and said nothing for a moment because he did not have words for what was in his face. Then he said, "I think we should start early tomorrow. I want to ride the Morgan pasture line before breakfast if the weather holds." She laughed because this was so completely him, the deepest feeling followed by the immediate return to the practical, and she loved him for it. "I'll have breakfast ready when you get back," she said. The Morgan pasture came to them in March of 1887, and with it, the Lawson land officially became something that required a map to describe. They had cattle on the south quarter and sheep on the north and east sections, and the garden and the preserve operation in Del Sanchez, and the fixed contract with Edwin Poole and James at 3 going on 30 and Clara me at 1, and bellowing her opinion of everything within earshot. And they had each other. Reuben Fitch, who now paid them grazing fees for the north section and had become, in the peculiar way of the frontier, something close to a neighbor if not quite a friend, stopped Matthew in town one spring afternoon and said, with the gruff directness of a man who does not easily give compliments, "You've done something real out there, Lawson. I'll say that." Matthew said, "We've done it," Fitch grunted. "Your wife's kept your books straighter than most bankers could." "She keeps everything straight," Matthew said. Fitch rode off, and Matthew stood in the Caldwell's Creek Main Street thinking about that. About the fact that 2 years ago Fitch had ridden up to his property and looked down at Pauline on her knees in the dirt and spoken to her in the tone of a man who considered her a temporary inconvenience. And now, he was acknowledging her contribution to a business that had been built from 1 acre, and the decision 2 people had made together to begin. He got on his horse and rode home, and when he came into the kitchen where Pauline was working with Grace Tanner's daughter on the preserve operation, the kitchen full of steam and the smell of peaches, he stopped in the doorway and just looked at her for a moment, and she looked up and raised an eyebrow. "Fitch says you keep the book straighter than most bankers," he said. She looked pleased in the restrained way she had when she was more pleased than she wanted to show. "That's decent of him." "I told him you keep everything straight." "That's also decent of you," she said. "Now go wash up because I need to know if the south fence on the Morgan pasture held the winter." "It held," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to her peaches. He went to wash up and he was smiling the whole way. The years moved forward in the way that good years do, each one fuller than the last. The cattle operation grew carefully, always careful with Matthew at the helm, expanding when the market supported expansion and holding steady when it did not. The sheep flock was a reliable income through conditions that made cattle expensive. And this balance, which had been Pauline's idea in the first place, and which Matthew had implemented with his characteristic thoroughness, proved over time to be the thing that made them more stable than many of their neighbors. James grew into a boy of serious purpose, and his father's quiet humor, trailing after Matthew and Dell through the pastures from the time he could walk far enough to keep up, learning everything about cattle and land management, with the focused attention that he had gotten equally from both his parents. Clara, 2 years behind him, was a force of nature in small boots, loud and funny and absolutely fearless, who fell off the fence rail and into the sheep pen at age 3 and came up laughing, and who at 4 informed Del Sanchez with great authority that he was doing the roping wrong, and who at 5 could name every animal on the property and remember which ones had been sick and what they had eaten. Del Sanchez, who had been with them for 3 years and showed every intention of continuing to be with them indefinitely, had become in that time something the Lawson household could not imagine being without. He ate at their table several nights a week and was as comfortable in their kitchen as anywhere he had ever been. And he taught James to rope and to whistle, and to tell the weather by the way the cattle moved. And he endured Clara's supervision of his work, with a patience that Matthew told Pauline quietly was one of Del's finer qualities. In the summer of 1888, Matthew and Pauline sat on the porch one evening in the long light, as they had sat on porches in the long light for 6 years now, and they looked out at their land. 241 acres, fenced and managed, sheep on the north and east, cattle on the south, the garden running along the south wall, the house with its sound roof and its 2 real bedrooms and the carved horse on the wardrobe door, the well and the second well and the seasonal creek on the Morgan pasture, the children inside at their supper, Del's lamp burning in the lean-to, and the sky overhead doing what the Texas sky always did at evening, going gold and then amber, and then that extraordinary deep red that Pauline had never been able to adequately describe in any letter she had written. "Do you remember," Pauline said, "the first time we sat on this porch together?" "May of 1882, Matthew said without hesitation. She looked at him. "You remember the month. It was the first time I felt like things might actually be all right," he said. "I remember things that felt that way." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did not do at other times because they were both practical people in public view, but here, on their own porch, she allowed herself things that she would not have allowed in any other context. He put his arm around her, easily and without thinking about it, the way you do a thing that has long since become natural. "Things are considerably better than all right," she said. "Yes," he said, "considerably." Inside, Clara's voice rose briefly in some emphatic declaration, and James's voice said something patient and older brotherly, and then silence resumed. "She's going to be something," Matthew said of Clara. "She already is," Pauline said. "She gets it from you." "She gets it from both of us," Pauline said firmly. "She has your stubbornness and my volume." Matthew laughed, and she felt it against her shoulder. The evening settled around them, warm and full of cricket sound, and the land lay quiet and solid beneath its enormous sky. And Pauline Lawson, who had come to this place with a traveling bag and 3 dresses and the decision to begin, sat with her husband on the porch of their home and felt, as she felt every evening in its particular way, that she had not just built something worth having, she had become someone worth being. And Matthew Lawson, who had placed an advertisement asking for a capable woman of good character to share a working farm, who had acquired 1 bare acre and a broken fence, and had spent 2 years alone wondering if he was building toward anything real, sat with his wife in the evening air, and thought that he had been right about one thing in his original assessment of what he was looking for. He had wanted something that worked. He had gotten something that worked in every way a thing could work, structurally and practically, and in the depths of who he was, something that had changed the shape of his life from the inside out. He had 1 acre and a broken fence. She had said, without hesitation, that it was enough, that they could begin. She had been right about that in more ways than either of them could have counted in 1882, standing in the wind in the middle of Caldwell's Creek with her hat blown away and everything uncertain. She had been right in every particular, about the land and the fence and the garden and the sheep and the partnerships and the contracts and the children, and most of all she had been right about the fundamental thing, that what was there was worth beginning with. That beginning was the whole point. Holly's Webb stone stood in the east quarter under the live oaks, and the grass grew around it as it had always grown, and the land remembered him. The broken fence stood repaired and solid along every line of the property. The acre, 1 acre acquired by a man who had saved 11 years for it, had become 241 acres of working land. The children slept under a sound roof. The ledger balanced. And on the porch in the evening, Two people sat together in the way that people sit when they have built something worth sitting beside, easy and present and grateful in the honest way, not performing gratitude but living it. Matthew pressed a kiss to the top of Pauline's head, the kind of small, intimate gesture that nobody planned and that meant everything because of it, and she settled closer against him. And they sat there, while the Texas evening went from red to deep blue to the first stars, and neither one of them needed to say anything at all, because it was all already said, in the land and the children and the years and the life they had made from 1 acre and a broken fence, and 2 people who had been brave enough to begin. The following spring, 1889, they bought 10 more acres to the south. They celebrated with a supper that Pauline cooked from the best of the preserved stores, and Dell and Grace Tanner's daughter, who had been working in the kitchen for 2 years and had become as much a part of the household routine as the morning coffee, both ate with them. And James told Clara very seriously that they now owned a very large amount of land, and Clara said equally seriously that she knew because she had counted. She had not counted. She was 5 years old, but no one corrected her. Matthew looked around the supper table at his family, his wife across from him, his children on either side, Dell at the end, the lamp burning steady, the sound of wind against the windows and the smell of good food and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of this life. And he thought of the advertisement he had placed in a Kansas City newspaper and the 3 letters and the April morning when a woman had stepped off a wagon in Caldwell's Creek and shaded her eyes against the glare and looked at him without pretense or performance. He thought of the fence. He thought of her saying, quietly and without hesitation, "That is enough. Let us begin." And he thought that the bravest thing he had ever done was honest words in a letter to a stranger, and the bravest thing she had ever done was answer them, and that everything else, all 251 acres of it, all the seasons and the children and the flock and the ledger and the sound roof and the stone in the east quarter, had flowed from that bravery, the way water flows from its source, naturally, inevitably, as if it could not have been otherwise. He raised his coffee cup and caught Pauline's eye across the table. She raised hers back. No words, none needed. Outside, the Texas night was wide and clear, and the stars were out in number, and the land stretched in every direction as far as anyone could imagine going, and in the spring it would all be green, and the lambs would be coming, and the garden would be going in, and the cattle would be restless with the new season, and James would be at Matthew's heels through all of it, and Clara would be at Pauline's, and Del Sanchez would be working the east fence with his hat pushed back and his whistle carrying across the morning air. And the fence, the whole perimeter of everything they had built, would stand solid and unbroken, as it had stood for years now, as it would stand, because 2 people had decided in the spring of 1882 that 1 acre and a broken fence was enough to begin with, and they had been right.